Welcome back, everyone. I'm calling this podcast Waste Not, and I'm going to attempt to accomplish two things. First, I'm going to perhaps give the world's quickest and most simplified history of Western philosophy. But what I would like to do is try to tease out one of the main themes that runs through it all and show how that's very applicable to the issues that I've been dealing with. And then the second part, I would like to attempt to deal with one more feedback loop. And it is one that I have omitted from my other podcasts until now. Very deliberately, because one, I think it's very important and I wanted to spend a little more time on it, and two, because it is a very it's in a sense swimming against a very strong current of cultural norms, and so I wanted to give it enough time to try to give it a full argument without getting completely dismissed right from the beginning. So I remember decades ago when I was in middle school and high school, and for me, history back then was really more of a chore. And it may have been that I didn't have the best teachers, but I think also a big part of it was my personality. And you know, all history has some sort of narrative, and the narrative that I was following through the textbooks was always a political one, or of wars, or who was dominating when, or who was conquering when, and vaguely interesting to me, but it was like dates and names, which don't come naturally to me. It was really, I did what I needed to do to get my A, but it was really, I had to struggle and I had to memorize all these dates and names. But when I got to college, and then I declared a philosophy major, I did it a little bit reluctantly because I knew that at the very center of the whole major was this course called History of Philosophy. And this was very serious. It was huge. It was like a 4-hour course for a whole year, for 2 semesters. So it was kind of like the centerpiece and center block of everything else, just kind of dominated your whole year. And I went into it with some trepidation, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm just going to have to memorize dates and names. But it turns out that I have the kind of personality that if you are giving me a narrative, a historical narrative of how people think and why that has led to many of our actions and what we have done historically, it turns out that I'm very interested and I track very easily. And it was much easier for me. But part of it too was I had a fantastic teacher. It was this guy who had come over from Britain decades and decades ago. He had been teaching. I mean, he was near retirement. This was one of his last years, I think maybe his last year to teach. And he was down to just this one course, and he had been teaching for 40, 50 years. But he taught this whole course, and he pretty much taught it without notes. It was pretty impressive, the depth and breadth of his knowledge, but can still remember his voice. Isms, ists, and ismists. But he definitely made it very much alive, at least to me, in my personality. So it was a good fit for me. So he, unfortunately, is going to roll over in his grave as I try to simplify 8 hours of college credits into a tiny, teeny little podcast here. But let's see if we can succeed in teasing out what we need for the subject at hand. So, of course, if you're dealing with philosophy and you're starting at the beginning, you have to contend with the ancient Greek philosophers. And the main guy there, the king of the ancient Greek philosopher, was Plato. And somewhat interestingly, he came out of a time when the philosophers of his time were really wrestling with what was the really essence of the world. They were all trying to figure out how the world ticked and what was behind things. And so you had one side and one faction saying that the world was all about being, and then you had another faction saying, no, it's about change and becoming. And so he was doing a synthesis. And so he said, yeah, sure, we live in this material world and things are always changing. He gave his famous, he provides us with his famous metaphor of, we see, and we're in a cave and we see shadows of the real thing. But what's somewhat interesting is that he wanted to play both sides, and he wanted to kind of be able to make a whole out of the two sides. And so he said, yeah, we live in the material world, but there's this other world, the world of the mind, world of the spirit, the nous, and it's where you find the forms. And so in this upper world was everything of that was eternal, and it was of being, and it didn't change. And so he would talk about a horse, and up in the realm of the mind and the forms, up in this realm there was horse, the noun with capital H, horse. And then all horses down here in the material world, they participated, is how he puts it, or how it was translated. They participate in the form of horse up there. And so a horse is only as good as much as it is approaching the perfectness and the perfection of horse, capital H, up in the world of the nous. And so in a sense, as he was trying to assimilate two different worldviews, he ended up somewhat being responsible for, in a sense, rendering our world into two. And so we end up with the world of our experience and of change, and then we have this other world of the mind, of the spirit. And in that other world was as well, you have the forms of not just nouns, but you would have the forms of all your virtues. And so, you'd have capital L for love, and you would have, justice, and on and on. And it was only in so much as that we acted and participated and approached the perfection of these things that we lived a good life. But in rendering the world into two, you can kind of see in retrospect that much of Western philosophy was about following one way or another, or emphasizing, I should say, one realm or the other. So one is the mind and the other is our experience. And so my professor, from very early on, possibly even the first lecture, I don't know, he would go up to this big board, and I don't even remember if it was chalk or dry eraser. I think we might have been new technology at that time, and we had a big, huge dry eraser board. He would huge board, and he would draw this massive X, and that was to represent the pattern of the history of thought. And these two lines, one was the line of rationality, and one that emphasized the mind, and that the world of the objective and the world of that which was always true, and what could be, abstraction, whatnot, and that was championed by the rationalist. And then the other line was emphasizing and said, no, we understand the world through our experience. And so that was the existentialist. And so you have right in the middle of that X, you have Kant. And again, he was trying to synthesize the two traditions. And so he has his mental constructs. And so he had the two worlds of noumena and phenomena. So of noumena is of the mind and the a priori, that which just is as it is. And then you have the world of phenomena, of experience, of senses, of taste and feel. And so most all philosophers, in a sense, can be sort of placed on this line that how are they dealing with these two realms? How are they dealing with this sort of dichotomy and what's going on? So to give a quick example of kind of where those two sides fall, you have Descartes as the rationalist. So here was this philosopher who they're always doing these crazy thought experiments. And he was like, well, my senses are fooled. I've often had my senses fooled. So really, I'm doubting everything. So if I doubt everything, then is there anything left that I can know for sure? And he goes through this lengthy process and mental exercises, and he says, in the end, the only thing that I really know is that I think. And so because I think, therefore I am. And so here was a champion of the rationalist one who said, well, the ultimate and the most fundamental as you go down is the mind and the fact that the brain works and that you think and you have thoughts. And that's the true foundation of who we are, and everything builds out from there. So if Plato had rendered the world in two, here was Descartes, and he kind of took a big giant crowbar into that chasm and levered it wide open, which is why we often use the phrase Cartesian dualism. So you have the separation between subject and object. You have the separation between romantic and classic, or dynamic and static, or form and matter, form and content. So that's a classic example of rationalist, and very much still alive today. The Enlightenment was definitely based on that, but even today, so Descartes had this. He did a quick mental exercise or metaphor. He says, I could have this devil that was just putting images in my head, and basically it could be fooling me that I even have a body, right? So this idea of just like this sort of disembodied brain that's just floating around, and it hallucinates, and that's what our body is. So that there's so much separation between mind and body that you could actually be fooled, and you might not even have a body. And so this is definitely still alive and well. It's definitely the basis of, like badass movies, sci-fi movies like The Matrix or so, where everyone who hasn't been enlightened, or so to speak, or hasn't taken the red pill, is just plugged into these sort of these cocoons, and their batteries for the machines and stuff. And even recently, I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson just not too long ago. He great mind there, and he says, it's very high probability that we are in a simulation, and that we are just living out the virtual simulation of a super AI, super artificial intelligence. So that idea of the mind, and the mind being dominant and separate so much that we might not even know that our body might be a complete illusion, is still very much a part of our culture, and very much dominant in a lot of thought. So the other side of that would be the existentialist. And the king of existentialists was Kierkegaard. And I did a whole course on Kierkegaard and did my senior paper, and I really quickly let you know where I fall on this side of this debate. But he was the existentialist, and he now let me back up a little bit, because it can be a little bit confusing, because typically your religious is definitely Platonic, in that sense of that they have two worlds, and there's the world of the mind, and then there's the world of spirit, and that's what informs what things should be down in the material world. And so typically, particularly the monotheistic religions, you have this setup, this metaphysical setup. So in the Jewish Old Testament, right? I mean, you can't get any more obvious or of this metaphor with God, hands down, stone tablets that he's written on the very laws of how you should live, and it comes down from above and is given into the hands of us, and these are the laws and what we should follow. So definitely, and then our morality is considered good in so much as we follow these laws that have been given down from above. And if you take Islam, definitely there's still that exact same trajectory of how we know how to live, right? So if you're a really conservative Muslim, you don't even think that the Quran should be translated into other languages, because the Quran is to be actually considered the very thoughts of God. And so when Muhammad was writing these down in Arabic, I guess, then these were the very thoughts of God. And so really the human part of that's really not, he was just the vessel. And so the morality and the norms and what you have, the laws and what should be, it comes down from above. And we live it out, and we're good in so much as we match up to those. Christianity is maybe a little bit, we have a little bit more wiggle room, and maybe that is because that's the tradition I grew up in, but certainly you have predominantly, that's the trajectory of things that, that we know, we follow the 10 Commandments as well, and we have, given from God of above, and the Bible in many, many more conservative circles, the Bible is inerrant or infallible, or it has authority. We use all these different language, but it's, most of the time, many Christians, and particularly conservative Christians, that the Bible is just pretty much given to us from God, and we'll know what to do if we read that. But there certainly are other traditions, and Christ himself was kind of a maverick. He was sort of this crazy Jew running around and breaking the Sabbath and breaking laws and trying to sort of provoke the authorities back then and say, hey, the man was made for the law or for the Sabbath, and Sabbath was made for man and not man for Sabbath. And it's kind of turning things on his head. So there's definitely an argument there about the spirit of the law versus the actual law. And, but regardless, the vast majority of historically, we have the same trajectory of God from above, even Christ himself, he was the Word became flesh, and he was the Word, the capital W. He was basically a form. He was the Logos, and he came down and incarnated himself into this world, this phenomenal world, this world of material, and then showed us how to live and go on from there. So we definitely have the religions tend to side on the rationalist side. However, this was all in preamble to get to Kierkegaard, because he was a Christian and he was a theologian. He was from Denmark. But however, he said, yeah, sure, there's God and there's that whole thing, but we're human and we experience the world through our senses. And that's what we've got. And our mind is great, but that's not really, it doesn't flow top down. He actually argued that we flow bottom up. And so his language was much more of emergence. And he was known for the phrase leap of faith. That's always associated with Kierkegaard, and people assume that it's a religious thing, but it wasn't really. It was much, much more than that. It was a more epistemological term. So epistemology would be how do you know things? And so he observed, he had a very different approach than like Descartes. So he's like, we're as kids, we get all sorts of information into us, and we see things, and we start creating these worldviews, and we think we understand the world, and we've got this framework, and then we start getting more data in, and then we get to this point where this big contradiction. The data is contradicting our worldview, and a healthy individual, when you are, have this paradox and you have this confrontation, then there has to be this really a dying to the old ways of thinking, and you have to take this leap of faith to a new and a broader understanding that definitely encompasses more data, encompasses all the old data as well. It's not like you're throwing away the old stuff, but it's a broad, so he in a sense broader and bigger concentric circles. And so this is the language of Gestalt. This is the language of emergence. This is the language of symbiotic, emerging systems, much of the language that I use when I talk about ecology. So those would be two examples, maybe champions of the different sides, the different schools of thought, of one that places the emphasis on the mind as being more fundamental, and the other, Kierkegaard, placing the emphasis on our experience and that being more fundamental. And you see a trajectory of top down versus bottom up. And a couple other things that I'd like to point out that are going to play into this whole dichotomy and what we emphasize, and that would be some of the influences on of the Greeks onto Christianity, because I think our culture here in America is very heavily influenced by Christianity, and Christianity was very heavily influenced by the Greek. And so you have in Plato, he didn't dwell a lot on this, but he did have this problem he had to deal with in his metaphysics, which metaphysics is just how you see the world and how things are set up. And so when he had set things up, the forms in that which exists in the world of eternal and being and pure, right? Like how does creation happen, which is a world of change, and in a sense, you can't be tainted, or you can't, if you're everlasting or you're constant, you can't be tainted by change. And so it was a question put to him, and he had to deal with it, and he ends up having three iterations of God. Well, first I should say that of the forms, Plato had this idea that there was the form of forms. And so that plays really easily into, as you can see, very easily adapted into what the religions would consider God. So he had a form of forms, and all forms were only perfect in so much as they, participated in the form of forms, right? But this form of forms couldn't be the creator, or he couldn't be tainted by the world, the material world. So he has like three iterations, or two iterations, I should say. So, Plato doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but he does talk about the world soul and then the demiurge, and then these are what can actually begin to interact with the world that we live in. And you have a very similar thing going on with Christ being incarnate. And there's no doubt, at least in my professor's mind, there was no doubt that this sort of three or two iterations of the form, making three, so to speak, was the precursor of Christian the doctrine of Trinity. And so, but as you can already hear in my language, as soon as you make one world more important or hierarchical to the other, it didn't take any time at all for one world not just to be more dominant and hierarchical, but one world to be good and one world to be evil. So before you knew it, there was this movement in the Greek of Gnosticism, I guess. And so the Gnostics believed that knowledge was of utmost importance, and they claimed to have secret knowledge, so they had either the secret knowledge of politics and how to rule, or they had the secret knowledge of God or whatnot. And but more importantly, they went as far as to vilify the material world, so that flesh was actually evil. And this was definitely taken up into Christianity, and you see it heavily in Paul's writings. And so he really struggles with this in many of his writings. He's coming ever so close. He comes like a hairbreadth away from really saying that the spirit is good and that the flesh is evil. Christians will tend to argue that he didn't say it because you have horrible repercussions if flesh becomes actually evil. But the farthest he got at one point was like, look, he says, if you're burning with lust and you're going to go around and you're going to, be having sex out of wedlock and having kids, whatever, that's obviously bad. So if you can't help yourself, then, you should get married. But it's much better if you don't have to deal with those desires, and then you just keep yourself single, and then you can devote your time to God, and that's just much more important. So he all but says that the world of the spirit and the world of the mind and all this and morality and ethics, that's not only detached from the body and that's only separate, but that it's much more important. So the other stuff may be beneficial. May be permissible, but it's not beneficial. And I think a lot of this is probably much of what was at the root of why historically you see a lot of dysfunction of the church with sexuality and whatnot. But not just the church. Our culture in general has this problem with the flesh. And interestingly, I pushed this a little further because I think that what we do is that we champion the mind, and we have lost touch. Part of the fallout of when you emphasize the mind and the body is maybe not outright evil, but just not important, is that we've lost our place. And that goes back to what I've talked about we don't even know how to interact with nature anymore. The fact that we have to even figure out how to interact with nature, we've rendered ourselves apart. And so this is kind of the segue into my next section, but I just want to reemphasize just that, here we are, and we're dealing with some pretty serious issues, and for me, one of the biggest issues I think is definitely climate change, and here we are, and everyone's dealing about temperatures rising and carbon increasing in the atmosphere, and so our tendency as culture, as Western culture, is to figure out solutions of the mind, and right along with that, it's solutions of the mind are not of the body, right? The solutions are involved. Either we come up with laws, or we come up with we're gonna regulate this, and we're gonna cut our emissions, and we're gonna plan to do this, and so that's one way. Or we're gonna we come up with technology, so like we get all excited because we figure some scientist is gonna figure out how to spray some material into the sky that's gonna reflect the sun back. All this crazy linear thinking, we have too much heat, we have too much carbon, therefore we're gonna we're gonna spray this here, or we're gonna mechanically do something here, and technology is gonna save us. And I think this is a direct result of what has won out historically, philosophically, and that the mind is the most important. And this is going to bring me, this would be the segue to my next section. My next section is about us as human beings and a feedback loop. And part of me really hopes that a lot of people saw this gaping hole in my podcast earlier and what I was avoiding, because let me try to put it this way. So here we have, we have humans that, say whatever, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we were not that big on the planet. We had this mind, and we were crazy smart, and we were affecting things disproportionately from, maybe other animals. And here we've grown into this massive species, this massive race, and now we're not just a nobody growing onto the stage. We are dominant in more ways than one. But I want to focus on the actual physical, right? So the actual, I could even say the actual flesh. So here we are, and now we're at 7 billion or whatever the number is of our population. And just the sheer biomass. We're talking about just the sheer biomass. We outdo any other mammal, and I guess I looked it up quickly, and it was okay, there's some insects that have a lot more weight than we do, biomass than we do, and there's krill, and there's bacteria and whatnot. But we're a serious contender. We are a huge chunk of the biomass on this planet, and to try to get that in perspective, what that means and what we're looking for in solutions. So here we are, and we're this enormous species with all this biomass, and everyone who's in a civilized in a civilized country or whatever, they would dream of doing anything else besides shitting in the drinking water. And so here we have an unbelievable amount of biomass that just gets flushed down, literally flushed down the toilet. And it goes into our waterways, and this manure, and this goes into waste management plants where we treat it, and we put these crazy chemicals on it, and we try to render it as neutral as possible. And then plenty of times we're just not good enough with that. And like if you talk about New York, they have this whole sewage system that's linked to the water runoff during a storm. So then they have to open up the gates so that the municipalities, the water treatment places don't get overrun. So that goes up into the ocean. So much of what we do is we not only are flushing it down the system, but we're concentrating all our manure into extraordinarily concentrations that are absolutely toxic to wherever it ends up. And so if we go back to what I was talking about, feedback loops, and if we talk about that cow who's on her pasture and she's in communication constantly, an essential piece of that communication was her excrement and all that bacteria. Over half the manure is bacteria, and it's going out into the field, and it's providing nutrients. And as that bacteria is eating other things or dies itself, suddenly all these nutrients are available to the plants, and then the whole cycle can go on, and you can go on to be sequestering carbon, you can go on to be, growing soil, you can go on to keeping water and into your soil, and all those good things that we talked about with the cow. So now here we are as a species, and we don't do any of that. So we've cut off this feedback loop. So we have this resource that, in a sense, if we were one of those feedback loops that was ameliorating the place and ameliorating the planet, then, we would be building soil and fertility as we go. But we don't. Mostly because we have a history of concentrating it in these big cities, and then, it ended up historically getting piled up into concentrations that were just horrendous and made, living conditions next to impossible. So, like to try to give an alternative to that. And I am by no means am original here. There's a great book by Joseph Jenkins, and it's called The Humanure Handbook. And basically, it's a book about compost. It just happens to be that the material used in the compost is our own manure. And, we hear just recently, a couple months ago, there was an article in the New York Times about how compost was a fantastic way to sequester carbon in the soil, and it was getting plants to, sequester more carbon, and it was just a fantastic way. And, here we could, and that was fantastic. I was really happy to read that. But to me, in my mind, there were some critics to that, and they were saying, well, that's a lot of work, and that's like, among the criticisms of it was just like, it takes a lot of energy to make this compost, and where you're going to get all this fuel and whatever. And here we have, every day, we have, we can participate on the intake. We participate in one system or another by eating. Well, we can participate with one system and another as it comes out the other end. So in the Humanure Handbook, and this is what we've done for years and years and years, is basically you have to have enough carbon. I think it's like 30 carbon molecules to 1 nitrogen, and that if you make that mix, that's the perfect mix for compost. And basically, what ends up happening is that you negate the smell. So you don't have to really, one of the things that people, when they come to our house, they are just, and it's a new concept to them, they just have a really hard time believing how the smell is completely neutralized. And we live in an area where we're blessed with just a lot of sawmills, so we have sawdust, and that's our source of carbon. Now, it can be pretty much anything, but that's a fantastic one, and we oftentimes can get raw shavings or sawdust, as they call it, which are smaller particles and very biologically active and whatnot. So basically, we do our business in a 5-gallon bucket, but it's in this box with a nice toilet lid, and And we collect it that way. And then when we have enough buckets, we get them together and we take them out and we make a bin. We use pallets. So that's going to be 4 by 4 approximately. And we use a lot of hay, because we're not going to turn this, right? That was another criticism of compost. Oh, you got to keep turning it and whatnot. But if you do it right and you add enough hay, which is allowing enough oxygen to be trapped in there, there's this beautiful thing that happens. And again, we're talking about systems that are just latent there in the ecology, and they're just waiting to happen in unbelievable, beautiful systems that are synergistic with each other. So you stick a pile of this manure, and it's got all the urine in as well. So you have high nitrogen, and you have all this fecal matter, and it's got all kinds of bacteria in it and everything, and you have it with sawdust so that it's stable. So you have that's your carbon. And then you put it in this bin, and you have a lot of hay, and you do a layer of the human manure, and you do a layer of the hay, and then we might do maybe 3 layers because we have a ton of people here, and so we have to do it at least once a week here, and we have many buckets. So we do, we'll do a layer, a few inches thick, and then we put a big layer of hay, and then another few layer of the human manure. And what happens is compost is this beautiful thing, and the bacteria get going, and they just start munching, and they're digesting and doing what they do to all this material. So, by the way, we also have all our kitchen scraps and all our other compost, anything that's organic, and whether it's like even if you happen to use a paper towel or you happen to use a Kleenex, that all goes, and that's all going to go back. That's extra carbon there. Heck, you throw the toilet paper, the roll at the end, you throw that in there too. But all our kitchen scraps go in there. And so it all goes into the bin, and then the bacteria get going, and they just start eating all the stuff. Well, all that activity actually starts creating heat, and then there's these microbes and these bacteria just hanging around, and they're called thermophiliac, which basically means they love heat. And so it is amazing. You could pretty much set your thermometer to the different thresholds of what's going on. So these guys will bring it up to like 111, if I remember right. I used to check this all the time with my thermometer because I wanted to make sure I was doing it right. It goes up, the activity goes up, it heats up, 111, boom, boom, boom. And it's there for a while. But then enough heat is created at that level, and then when all of a sudden, I don't know what it is, but a threshold is crossed, a Kierkegaardian leap goes on, a gestalt happens, and then suddenly you go to this next level, and even more the heat-loving bacteria, that they like it even hotter, and they take it up to 120, I'm going to forget, 124 or something up there. And there is another level up there, but we never really shoot for anything higher than that, because we know that if it's at 124, the beauty of that is that you have that at 3 days there, and it's going to kill all pathogens. But it's not so hot that it's going to kill all the bacteria and all the good stuff. So that gets done, it heats up, it does its thing, it might be there, have heated up for a good while, but in that pile, maybe, we might put more and more as it goes until we've completely filled that bin up, and it's several times on several occasions has heated up, done its thing, and then we let it sit for a year. And there's all this whole ecosystem that comes in, whether it's worms or beetles or nematodes or bacteria or microbes or everything you can think of comes in and just takes what's now completely neutralized, and it's in a really available form, and they turn it to an even better form. So, we can dig in there. If you go in there a few months later, there's no smell, and there's just covered in red worms, and they're doing their thing, and they're just turning it into beautiful, beautiful soil. And so here we have an answer, and if here we are. You're basically taking carbon and you're putting it back into the soil, and you're making, at the same time, you're making something that's nutrients that are totally available to grow plants. Now, we're very careful. We don't want to put that on anything we would ever sell, so we just actually put our human manure and we quote unquote waste it in our flower beds, because we don't, we wouldn't want anyone to go, oh my God, they eat, from soil from the poop. But it would, if we could get to the point where we weren't utterly scared of all this, of our bodies, and we weren't scared of the flesh, and we didn't demonize it, we could actually look for solutions for these global problems right from our body. So we can look for these solutions and participate in systems from eating, but then we could also do it on the other side of things. And so that was basically the feedback loop that I was very reluctant to address. But I do think that if we're going to try to talk about being connected and reconnect with nature and pretty much figure out who we are and what we're doing and find a place, that it has to happen at that end of things as well. And that, I know it's much easier for us. We're out in the country and we have access to sawdust, but I don't know how you could ever address global problems if we never address the fact that we are a species that's growing and we're just only getting more and more, multiplying more and more until we have billions and billions. And then if we continue to consider our output of our feedback loop as waste and as something that we have to spend energy on instead of using it as something that could build and regenerate the ecology and the environment, then I just have a hard time seeing how we're going to ever come up with solutions, especially mechanical ones. That's where I fall on things. And I know I'm asking, and I'm asking a lot for people to even consider something like this, but that's where I fall on it, and it fits right in as I understand feedback loops. And the whole spiel about the history of philosophy and was really to tease out this sense of that we've lost our connections with our bodies and with nature, because we've considered the mind as more important, and in a sense that's sort of won out, and then it's changing. And you can see even in philosophy of today, there's a lot of, even as we're studying intelligence and whatnot, we're learning so much more. Well, I've gone on a little longer than I had planned, but I have possibly managed to make my old philosophy professor roll over in his grave, and I may have also grossed other people out. But I've said what I wanted to say, and I do appreciate everyone who was listening.